Shalom, and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levi. You can learn more about me, subscribe to the podcast, or be in touch through my website at rabbieitan.com. That's RABBIEITAN.com. In this week's episode, I make a heartfelt plea in favor of American exceptionalism on behalf of the world. I talk about what, if any, beliefs are mandatory in Judaism, and I give a bit of a short audio tour of Eastern Gush Etzion. So without further ado, on with the show. It's political season for those of you in the United States and those of us around the world who have some interest in what's going on in American politics, which, because of the status of the U.S. as the world's one and only superpower, the greatest and most powerful nation in the history of humanity, includes pretty much everyone. And for the isolationists in the U.S., from the left, who want to focus all their energy on domestic issues, and the right, who want to turn away from foreign entanglements so they can downsize the government, you need to understand that doing so is nothing less than an abdication of your responsibility. The world is a china shop, and you're in the middle of it. And you're a big guy. If you run away, you'll break everything. If you crash forward blindly, you'll also break everything. The only hope of getting out of there with everything intact is to stay and deal with the complexity of reality. Because the security of most of the free nations of the world, the Western-style democracies, is dependent in one way or another on U.S. power. Every step you take back is a step given up to someone else. No power vacuum can last long in this world. And don't delude yourselves the way parts of the left do, that you don't really have enemies except the ones you've created yourselves. Certainly U.S. policy has been responsible for creating some monsters, but there will always be monsters. That doesn't mean you simply can choose not to fight them. There is still evil in the world, and don't delude yourself the way parts of the right do, that we can safely just focus on personal liberty at home, and somehow the reasons our government got so big in the first place, mostly through fighting wars, if you look back historically, will just be magically pushed away from the shores of the Great Republic. Like it or not, you have a responsibility. Yes, you need to deal with domestic issues, first and foremost. Yes, you need to avoid unnecessary, costly, and poorly thought out foreign entanglements. But you can't run away. The United States chose to build the post-war order of the world, that is, after World War II, in its image. And this was one of the greatest acts ever done for humanity. The rebuilding of Western Europe and Japan after World War II and the huge investment that was required to get stable democracies up and running in those countries has allowed the freedom of hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions, to flourish, and for the idea of democracy to spread, at least as an idea, if not as a practice, to every corner of the world. But in doing so, you've made yourselves indispensable. By functioning as the military arm of Europe for 70 years, they have become dependent on you, whether they acknowledge it or not. And by pegging the world's finances to the dollar, which was a very conscious decision on the part of U.S. policymakers, and encouraging its use as the international currency, you've made the world's well-being dependent on your own. In the shadow of the two greatest cataclysms of human violence to ever shake the world, the United States took upon itself to also defend the free world from the expansion of totalitarian communism. And I know, not everything done was pretty or right or even necessarily tactically useful. There were a lot of blunders. In fact, there were wars, maybe some of which shouldn't have been fought, and many innocents who died. There were dictators supported and mujahideen and other unsavory characters. And it didn't always work out in the end. But in the end, it did. And now that nowhere in the world can a government say outright, can get away with saying outright that they reject democratic principles, where even the most horrendous dictator pays lip service to the democratic will of the people, because that idea has become almost universally accepted all over the world. And now that your economy is a bit of a mess and your politics are broken, you want to withdraw. You're tired, you're angry, and you have reason to be. But on behalf of that sizable chunk of the globe who depends on the U.S. to be the grown-up in the room, to make it clear that some things are simply not acceptable, to be a beacon of idealistic light in a cynical world, even if we don't always like your choices. We need you, because a well-intentioned giant who occasionally knocks over a prized vase is better than the arsonist who wants to burn down the museum and replace it with a horror show. Pacifism, the idea that no use of force is ever acceptable, is the morally indefensible and morally repugnant abandonment of the responsibility that comes with power. It is choosing to allow millions of lives to end or continue in squalor at the will of a dictator, or for human misery and oppression to continue indefinitely to another generation and another, when you may have the ability to make a difference. There is nothing about the way the world works that guarantees things will get better. Right will not always be victorious over her enemies, and when good men sit and do nothing, they guarantee that it won't be. I was recently involved in a discussion thread where many Jews, mostly of a more liberal persuasion than myself, Reform and conservative, but not all, were arguing that Judaism doesn't have any requirements of belief. And strictly speaking, there may be some truth to that. But Orthodox Judaism does make a number of specific theological and historical truth claims. For instance, that the world was created by God, that God is omniscient, omnipotent, and good, that the Torah was given by God to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, that the oral Torah was also given at Sinai. That is, the originally oral tradition that was eventually written down and codified in the Talmud. These are core beliefs of Judaism, and our worldview and religious practice becomes pretty much nonsensical without them. But the question is anybody required to believe these things? Are you committing a sin if you don't believe the oral Torah was given at Sinai? Will you be punished by man or God? Jewish law rarely deals with what is in your heart, except when trying to figure out the intention behind your actions. For instance, whether something is murder or manslaughter. While we're encouraged to do certain things and support certain beliefs, there is no place in Jewish law, that I know of anyway, where a lack of belief itself brings punishment upon someone. You're punished or rewarded for what you do in Judaism, not for what you think. So to be clear, there are central beliefs in Judaism upon which our entire theological and legal structure stands. But as long as you follow the rules, there's really no punishment for having thoughts, just as there's no punishment for thinking about committing a more corporeal sin, that is something corporeal, meaning something involving your body, such as murder or stealing. Thoughts of doing bad things cross our minds all the time. Of course, I guess some of us more than others. But if we don't do them, there's no penalty. In fact, you might say it's a good thing. It shows that you've overcome your evil inclination. Now, there's an obvious problem with this. If you allow contrary ideas to circulate freely and become accepted normative ideas in a structure which stands or falls on ideas, you're essentially allowing the slow internal destruction of the faith. When we modern people, who are used to having freedom of speech guaranteed more or less by powerful states and consider it a prime value in itself, we tend to think of talking as being similar to thinking. They are both in the realm of ideas as opposed to action. Of course, this gets fuzzy when you're talking about taking action, such as the clear and present danger law in the US, but let's leave that aside for now. That's sort of the modern view, but in Judaism we give great weight to words, whether they be written or spoken. A word that leaves your lips is no longer a thought. Speaking is an action, what a modern sociologist might call a speech act. Now, when taken to its most extreme, or if enforced with violence by a coercive state, the banning of heretical beliefs leads to severe suppression of free thought, which is one of the building blocks of human flourishing as we understand it today. But by law, Judaism does not prescribe speaking a heretical thought in and of itself. Ideas are meant to be expressed, debated, put in context, etc. But if a teacher takes these false ideas, that is, false in the Orthodox view, and uses their authority to teach them to others as truth, or to encourage a break from Judaism, that is, that they should no longer keep the commandments, that is a sin according to Jewish law, and one of the more severe ones. Ideas which don't necessarily lead to a breaking with Jewish law, no matter how unorthodox those ideas might be, are usually tolerated. One obvious example could be how one thinks the Messianic age will play out, whether the raising up of the dead promised by our prophets is literal or somehow metaphorical or spiritual. Are we going to see zombie Jews getting up, or is this going to be some sort of souls returning to God kind of thing? But ideas which inherently chip away at the authority of Judaism, such as, for instance, a deist worldview, where God just set the world in motion and stepped away, and he doesn't care what we do, those kinds of ideas are deeply problematic. And while it may be important in some cases to engage in those ideas, both for intellectual honesty and to strengthen ourselves in our beliefs, it shouldn't be done with the intention of adopting them or teaching them as fact. So in the end, the claim that Judaism doesn't have any requirements for belief, at least as far as Jewish law and punishment goes, it's true. But when those thoughts become acts, through speech or otherwise, then we have to tread more lightly. Now, I hope I managed to make this clearer instead of just muddying the waters. If I managed to confuse you about a problem you didn't even know existed, my apologies. When I walk out my door and walk a few feet, I can see what looks like a volcano in the distance. There's a road and some stonework sticking out at the top of it. This volcano-shaped hill is the burial place of Herod the Great, called Herodian in Hebrew, or Herodium in Latin, which is the main attraction for tourism in the area I live in. Here on the plain of Tekoa, near my home, is where Herod defeated an army of Parthians with a Roman legion at his command, and crowned himself king of Judea. With Roman backing, that is. And so here, on an unprepossessing hill, he chose to build a palace and name it after himself, Herodian. And when he was close to death, he had the whole thing covered over with dirt as a giant funeral mound and monument to himself, and his tomb was constructed on the slope facing Jerusalem. From the top of the hill, you can see all the way over the Judean desert and the Dead Sea to the hills of Jordan. And if you turn around, you can see Jerusalem and Bethlehem, off in the distance. From the top of the hill, you walk down into the palace, which has been excavated and is really beautiful, and see Herod's private Roman bath with one of the oldest still standing domed roofs in the world, and his reception room. And you see where, in later generations, the Jewish rebels of both major revolts, the Great Revolt, which resulted in the destruction of the temple, and the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, turned the reception room into a synagogue and dug mikvaot, ritual baths, into the floor, and tunneled through the water system of the place to create an underground fortress. Then, as you drive down from the national park on top of the hill, you see a tiny village on the hillside. That is called Sde, a school where teenagers who don't fit in the normal school system can live and work on what's essentially a goat farm with a few classes here and there, and hopefully be kept out of trouble until they can be shipped off to the army. The farm has a little restaurant with gourmet breads, preserves, cheeses, and salads, all from very local produce, very fresh and delicious, and the view from the patio is breathtaking. Just over the canyon from Stebar, you can see it from there, is my hometown of Tekoa. We have a local winery, a horse farm that can take you on rides down into the Tekoa Canyon, or Wadi if you prefer, and a trail that leads down to a large cave. I love to take people to the cave, but only if they're willing to get dirty, because there's a spot where you have to slither on your belly through a small opening. This area is called Eastern Gush Etzion, and is just a 10-minute drive from Jerusalem. Now, I do private day tours to the area, so if you're planning to be in Israel, get in touch and let's plan your trip. It's really a hidden gem, and it's so close to the city and really easily accessible. You can email me at eitan@rabbieitan.com. Spell Eitan E-I-T-A-N, so eitan@rabbieitan.com, and let's go there together. We'll connect to the times of the temple, the Jews who fought the Roman Empire, and the modern rebirth of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. That's all for this week's episode of Jewish Geography. If you liked it, please go to rabbieitan.com and subscribe. Leave a nice review on iTunes, share on Facebook, or however you can help get this to more people. That would really be super helpful. In the meantime, I'll try to be back next week with a new episode, but I'm afraid it might not happen because, thank God, I'm going to be busy touring most of the time. So it may be another couple of weeks before I get back to you, but I will do my best, and at most, I'll be back in 2 to 3 weeks. And in the meantime, God bless and be well.